Hey everyone, we are going to be reading chapter 9 of Whale Song. At first, the pouch seemed to be working its magic. My mother complained that the cold dampness made her body ache, but other than that, her condition, as they referred to it, appeared to be under control. Most of the time, my parents called it PPH. Whenever I heard that phrase, my ears would perk up. A week before Christmas, my father left early in the morning and returned mid afternoon with a surprise. My grandparents, Nona Sofia and Nona Rocco, lived in Vancouver, but for the past 5 months they'd been visiting family in Italy. Dad, my mother exclaimed. I thought you were still in Italy. What are you doing here? Nona Rocco winked at me. Visiting Sarah, of course. My grandfather was a burly man with a wide, infectious grin and snow white hair. He was always full of jokes and stories. Nona Sofia somehow put up with him, sometimes clucking at him in reprimand. She was a typical Italian grandmother. She wore her gray streaked black hair twisted into a bun. I loved it when she visited us because she always cooked her secret family recipes and made cookies and delicious sweets. My grandmother handed the tin to my mother. You're too skinny, Daniela. Good thing I'm here. Now, tell me more about this pulmonary hyper thing. My mother's smile drooped. Come, my grandmother said, leading her upstairs. My father patted my head. You'll have to give them your room for 10 days. He looked worried, as though he thought I would argue. I smiled. I'll survive sleeping in the living room. An hour passed before I saw my grandmother again, and when I did, she looked miserable. Her shoulders slumped and her wrinkled eyes drifted toward me, then darted away. Sarah, she called, come see what I have. She had brought me some drawing and art books illustrated by an Italian artist. I politely thanked her and took the books to my room. I enjoyed drawing, but compared to my mother, my figures were one-dimensional sticks with goofy faces. I never dreamt that I'd become an artist like my mother. My parents invited the Dixons to spend Christmas Eve with us, and it was one of the most magical nights of my childhood. They arrived in the afternoon carrying gifts and freshly baked sweets. While Goldie, Shonda, and I played board games, the women puttered around in the kitchen, and Mr. Dixon, Nona Rocco, and my father sat outside on the deck and discussed river fishing and deer hunting. Later, we exchanged Christmas gifts. I gave Goldie a scented fabric-covered photo album. I can put Robert's pictures in it, she said with a smile. I was pleased when my parents gave the Dixons a sculpture my mother had ordered from the gallery in San Francisco. Nona Sofia gave them 4 jars of her famous homemade spaghetti sauce and a bottle of Italian wine. She received a beautiful basket, a jade pendant, and some special tea in return. Jack, my grandmother said, can you get Nana's gift? My father disappeared for a moment and returned with something that brought tears to Nana's eyes. The painting of the gray wolf and the Indian girl. Nana squeezed my mother's hand. Thank you, Daniela. I'll treasure this always. Mrs. Dixon brought out some beautifully wrapped gifts and passed them to my parents. This is terrific, my father said, admiring a new tackle box filled with flashy lures. Now, maybe you'll catch bigger fish, my mother teased. She opened her gift and pulled out a pair of silver eagle earrings and a large hand-woven basket. Painted on it was a bald eagle soaring above a spruce tree. I love these, she said, her face beaming. Goldie pressed a small box into my hands. Without waiting for an invitation, I tore it open. Inside was a beautiful hand-carved silver bracelet. I didn't know what to say. It was carved specially for you by my brother Andy. Nana said. See, Hinayu? This is a mama killer whale and her baby, because we know how much you love them. Nana got it engraved too, Goldie said, her eyes sparkling. I flipped it over. The writing on the inside was etched in a beautiful scroll. To Hinayu, the wise one of the one who knows. I heard a sharp crack and swiveled my head over just in time to see an icicle snap off the roof outside and stab the snow below. A shiver raced up my spine. My grandparents returned home to Vancouver in January, and the chilly winter months passed by swiftly. By March, my mother appeared to have made a complete recovery. She even went back to painting, although my father cautioned her constantly to take it easy. I'm not sure she knew what that meant. She seemed almost driven by an unidentifiable force. She finished 2 paintings in record time and started on a third. One Friday morning, my father joined us for breakfast instead of hurrying off to work like he usually did. Want to go out on the schooner tomorrow? He asked me. That's a great idea, my mother said. I'll pack us a picnic lunch. My father frowned. Danny, perhaps you should stay. I feel great, Jack. Quit being such a worrywart. Early the next morning, we packed a large basket and drove to the harbor. When we reached the dock where the Finland Fancy was moored, I noticed another schooner in her place. Where's your boat, Dad? I asked, confused. And what's that one doing in your spot? My father chuckled. That's her, Sarah. I eyed him as if he'd lost his mind. What? She's been refinished inside and out, he explained. Looks great, huh? Stunned, I examined the Finland Fancy. She'd been given a fresh coat of paint to see her through the winter months and looked sparkling clean. Her deck had been stained in a cherrywood finish and the hull was painted a pale blue with a royal blue trim. Wow, I said, awestruck. I didn't even recognize her. Yeah, me too, when I first saw her, he said. Skip greeted us with a friendly salute, his white hair curling under his captain's hat. He patted me on the head, went to his cabin, and prepared to leave the harbor. Get Mom a glass of water, my father told me as he untied the moor lines and pushed off from the dock. I headed below deck to the galley, and poured water into 2 glasses, one for my mother and one for me. I took them up to where my father was fussing over my mother. Go below if the sun gets too hot, he warned her. Rolling her eyes, she settled into her chair and slipped on some sunglasses. Yes, dear. I released a pent-up sigh. It was wonderful to see her healthy again. Everything seemed normal, and I tried to put my fears to rest. Bundled warmly in blankets on the deck, we listened to the songs of the sea. With the echolocation equipment, we heard numerous fish, a couple of sea lions, and at last the familiar sound of the killer whale. My father scribbled constantly in his notebook, seemingly in another world, while my mother and I stared up at the clouds and tried to distinguish shapes and creatures. That one looks like a fairy, she said, pointing at a fluffy cotton candy cloud. Or an angel, I added. We gazed at the sky and watched the fairy angel dissipate until it stretched into an abstract design. It made me think of something I'd been meaning to ask her for a long time. Mum, do you believe in heaven? There was an imperceptible tremble in my mother's hand as she carefully plucked off her sunglasses and folded them in her lap. Then she released a long breath and her eyes skimmed across the water. I think it must be a wonderful place with no pain or sorrow, a place to be free, kind of like a big ocean where you can swim around in warm water without fear. Her eyes rested on me. Why do you ask, Sarah? I shrugged. I just wondered. Nana says that sometimes people can come back as an animal after they die. I mean, at least that's what the Nootka believe. What would you come back as? My father asked me. An eagle? No way, I'm too afraid of heights. My parents snickered loudly. I know what I'd come back as, my mother said. What? I asked. She reached over, picked up the headphones, and slipped them over her head. She grinned and passed them to me. At first there was only silence. Then I heard the soft keening of a whale. A whale? I guessed. She grinned. Then Dad could study me. Her eyes met my father's, and they glazed intently at each other for a long time. I studied them apprehensively, engraving that memory on my mind. Suddenly, I sensed a change in the air around me. It was as if we were in a vacuum. For a second, the breath was sucked right out of me. A shiver ran up my spine. And if I was a whale, my mother continued, you and your father could come out here and visit me every day, but you'd have to learn how to speak Orca so we could communicate. She made short clicking sounds and cried like a whale. I shrugged off my dark mood and laughed at her giddy behavior, but I felt a lump in my throat when I replayed the conversation in my mind. Look, my father shouted. My mother and I turned our heads in unison and saw 4 whales surfacing near the schooner. The pod frolicked in the water, and we shrieked when the largest whale lifted right out of the water and slammed sideways on the surface. Then I spotted something in the distance. A single killer whale swam about 30 yards behind the pod. It was a calf, and it was trying to catch up to the 4 adult whales. My father's brow pinched in bewilderment. That's the same calf we saw last time, but that's not her pod. They have different markings. Saddened, I gazed at the calf. Where's your family, then? He rubbed his face. She's somehow gotten separated from them. She's still rather young to be on her own, though. He flipped through his notebook and jotted something down. Will this pod take her in? My mother asked. He sighed. I don't know. I've heard it happen occasionally, but it's not common for a pod to adopt another whale. At that moment, Skip interrupted us. I think we should head in, Professor. The winds are changing and we could be in for a storm. My eyes drifted toward the lonely calf. She followed the other whales, always remaining a safe distance behind them. It was as if she were desperately trying to seek approval from the other pod. I knew how it felt to be different, to be an outcast. 2 days later, my mother relapsed and was back in Bamfield General. This time, she stayed in the hospital for 4 days, and Dr. Anders released her with strict warnings that she was to spend the next 2 days in bed. He said she needed to rest more during the day and gave her some medication to take daily. School had made special accommodations for me during the past month, and when I finally returned to class, I was greeted by a warm round of applause from my classmates and Mrs. Higginson. Everyone seemed to be happy that I was back, except Annie Pierce. On my way to the girls' washroom, I was ambushed. Annie shoved me inside and barred the exit. Her friends remained out in the hallway, guarding the door. Think you're something special, don't ya? Annie smirked. I felt like a kitten cornered in a cage with a voracious lion. You're just white trash, she muttered as she paced in front of me, and not even Canadian trash. Why don't you go on back to the United States? Trembling, I said, leave me a... Without warning, her foot shot out and connected with my knee. I felt a searing pain shoot up my leg, and the next thing I knew, I was shoved to the floor. White bitch, you think you're better than me? She stomped on my ribs, my arms, and my legs. Annie, stop it, I pleaded. Please, you're hurting me. Her furious eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought she was going to let me go, but she dragged me into one of the stalls and plunged my head into the toilet. I couldn't breathe. I choked on bitter toilet water, and my nose burned. I thought for sure that I was going to drown. My whole life of 11 years flashed before me. Mom? Dad? I began to fight back. I scratched at her arms and stabbed my nails into her skin, when she let out a piercing shriek and released me. I stared at her, terrified of what she'd do next. Annie, she crouched down by my face. You're nothing. My head smacked hard against the toilet bowl and blackness swirled around me. As I tried to stand up, a wave of dizziness overwhelmed me, and I fell to the floor. Voices faded in and out, invading the thick fog of my mind. Blurry faces stared down at me, concerned and caring. Then someone lifted me up, and I surrendered to the painful but welcoming darkness. Close your books. That's chapter 9.